The African American Legend series highlights the accomplishments of blacks in areas as varied as politics, sports, aviation, business, literature, and education. We will explore how African Americans have succeeded in areas where they'd been previously excluded because of segregation, racism, and lack of opportunity. I'm your host, Dr. Roscoe C. Brown, Jr., and joining us on today's program is Nona Smith, who's Education Director of the New York State NAACP, one who's taken a great deal of leadership in dealing with education in our community. And Nona, as we begin the discussion, would you tell us what you think the most important issues facing the New York City public schools are today?
I think the most important issue that we need to be addressing, and we're not spending enough time on that topic, is what's happening in the classroom. The classroom is the locus of change and improvement for our children, and I think our children are the central issue. And we tend to get involved in the politics and other issues and not enough into what's happening in the classroom.
I think that's true all over the country.
Yeah.
They're concerned about pupil achievement as reflected in tests and so on is only part of it.
Mm-hmm.
But the public education has been the bulwark of American democracy ever since we were founded.
Right.
And
right.
so now we're coming into this crisis where they say our children don't achieve, they're not secure,
mm-hmm.
they
mm-hmm.
don't
mm-hmm.
respect people. So, but those are all interactions between teachers, paraprofessionals, principals, administrators, with the individual child. So what you're saying then is that the NAACP, New York State NAACP's focus is on what's happening in the classroom.
Absolutely. The focus is on what teachers need in order to do a good
mm-hmm.
job, and a lot of our teachers, as we see it, do not have the resources that they mm-hmm. need in our schools. Mm-hmm. If we look at the emphasis on technology, as it should be, because mm-hmm. that's the new wave, the current wave and the new wave, many of our schools are not even wired for the technology of today. And teachers should have computers in their classroom. Every teacher should have a computer or a set of computers in their classroom for many projects. And we don't have nearly that kind of emphasis on technology as we should. So children are learning to use technology for educational purposes, nor its application for careers.
Of course, as you made that statement, you really relate it to something that deals with what you said in the first place. The focus is on the child and not the politics. Right. However, it is the politics that gets the money to wire schools at the cost mm-hmm. of $200,000 a school or, mm-hmm. or whatever mm-hmm. The figure is, a very high figure. So, and that's why the citizens and the elected officials get involved in the politics. Who controls the money? Who controls how do you get the money, how much you get, and how do you spend it? Mm-hmm. And that's why I know you and President Hazel Dukes of New York State chapters of the NAACP are focusing on not only what happens in the classroom, but mm-hmm. how do you get the money and how do you spend the money once you get it. Mm-hmm. In your opinion, do you think this trend toward having parents and community people involved in determining expenditures at the school level, what's called school-based management, do you think that's a good idea?
I think it's an excellent idea. I don't think we've reached the level of effectiveness and involvement that we need, but I think it's an excellent idea simply because parents and community can often do things to facilitate the delivery of services or delivery of economic resources that public employees may not be able to do some of the things that they can do. And the schools are community-based. They are among the resources in the community, so it is natural that the parents and community leaders should have an active role in that. So we're very pleased to see the movement that has been happening, and we've done a lot in that area, working with parents and collaborating with community-based organizations and other groups to focus on what's needed in our school and to relieve educators of some of those problems and concerns so that they can concentrate on the child.
Of course, you raised some interesting questions there. For example, the new union contract says that teachers don't have to do lunchroom duty. The question is, should parents come in and do lunchroom duty? And if they do lunchroom duty and their own kids are in there and their own kids are raising Cain, what are they going to do? In other words, there are some other kinds of issues that relate to that. Similarly, should parents determine what reading program teachers use to teach?
I don't say that parents should determine what reading program. I think parents should have a role in determining what reading program.
What role would that be?
I think they should be there to help to review so that it is a process of learning for them. Because after all, educators expect the parents to continue what they do in the classroom. And if the parents don't have knowledge and experience and understanding of what resources you're using in school, what skills they teach, and how they relate to the child's overall development. If they don't have that kind of knowledge, then it's less likely they're going to do the kind of job we expect of them. So they should be partners in this process.
All right, but let's take the reading. They have the whole language method and the phonics method. And there's a lot of disagreement among experts. Now you bring parents in, are parents going to take the lead, or are they going to respond to what they're told? For example, they say, well, you go home and you read to your children, and they read to the children. But my children don't understand the difference between the TH sound and the sound.
Okay.
Well, how do you do that? Because on one hand, those of us who are educators and leaders talk about what everybody else ought to be doing.
Right.
But let's think about how far, really the purpose of the question is, how far do parents and community people get into determining the actual learning process, or to what extent are they supportive of the learning process?
Well, I think after all, we as educators have gone to school X number of years and taken X number of courses and invested X number of dollars to do what we do. So we cannot expect a parent who does not have that kind of training, or a community leader who does not have that kind of training, to take the kind of role that we take. I think our role is to prepare them to support and be partners in a way that they reinforce what we do, that they understand what we do, because if they don't understand to at least to a certain extent, it's going to be difficult for them to reinforce it. But educators are trained and hired to take the leadership roles in teaching the child. And I think that parents can take leadership roles in the home. They do take leadership roles in the home. And those leadership roles that they take in the home and community should support or augment what's happening in the classroom.
Another part of the new school governance law in New York City has parents participating and community people participating in selection of the principal. What do you think about that?
Well, I've seen some good selection processes that involve parents, where parents have talked with me about some of the issues they raised on the selection committee, and they raised some very valid points. Sometimes there are things that we as educators may not think of. And for example, I'll never forget one PA president said to me, when I looked at this person's resume, there was nothing on there that showed that they'd done anything in the after school or been involved in the community in any way. And others had. So she felt that that was an important ingredient, and she made that point at the committee and asked everybody else on the committee to take that factor into consideration. So parents can play a very valuable role in that selection process, because they're not making the selection in and of themselves. So those things about which they do not have the technical expertise, the educators are there, to share that kind of knowledge and experience with them, to balance out or round out the selection process.
Now, I know the NAACP has a number of programs that relate to parent involvement and community involvement in the schools. What is the objective of those programs, and how do they work? Well,
our primary objective is to create a partnership between the home and school and the community. And just to reiterate something I said earlier, to support what's happening in the school, and so that educators can devote more time to real activities to educate the child. So we do workshops and seminars and conferences. As a matter of fact, we have a conference coming up May 3rd, our annual Parent Involvement Conference. We have people who come in to run activities, show parents what the curriculum is, what kind of activities can be used to teach subject areas, what kinds of things they can do in the home, and to help them understand what the governance process is so they can play a more active role in the governance process, to be involved in the Parents Association, to be involved on their school planning committees, to attend the community school district board meetings and the central board meeting. And that from the school to the district to the central board, that is an avenue for them to take their issues that are of concern to them.
Well, many times, I shouldn't say many times, sometimes parents feel they're not welcome in the school because of the attitude of the administrators and sometimes the teachers. What does the NAACP do in situations like that?
Well, that is true. I think some of us never got over the decentralization experiments back in IS 201 and Ocean Hill, Brownville, and I think some people are still on the battleground, so to speak, around those issues. What we try to do at the NAACP, and in some instances we've been very successful and others not so successful, is to help the school understand how the parents and the community can be a support to them and not a threat. And educators everywhere I've been are looking for supportive participants. And if we can get them to develop that kind of relationship or see the need for having that kind of relationship, that tends to work with educators.
On the other hand, sometimes parents have very valid complaints and they bring them to the school and they're not responded to.
Right.
And in a sense turned away.
Right.
Right. How do you, because I know NAACP is an organization, activist group.
Right.
How do you deal with a situation that where a particular school is just not responding to the parents?
Well, sometimes it means helping the parents to figure out another strategy for presenting their issues. Sometimes things happen and they are upset, and not that they shouldn't be upset, they should be. We do techniques to help them to role play how they're going to present their issues so that it's presented in a way that is non-judgmental, that it gets to the point, that they make their point without accusation. And we always help them to formulate what they can do to help resolve the problem or what they're willing to contribute to the problem, and to emphasize the importance of them being a partner with the school and discuss how they want to be a partner with the school. Sometimes that's a way of addressing it. Other times we've had to help them to put their issues in writing, and the same way, in a non-judgmental way, with recommendations, and begin at the school level or the teacher level and move up the ladder. That's been the way that we've had to do some things, because people in the school felt that they were right and they may not have been. An honest mistake. I won't say that they deliberately.
Well, in the
Honest
tradition
mistake.
of the NAACP, I know the New York State chapter of NAACP and Legal Defense Fund are all involved in a suit against the state because of inequitable funding of education.
Right.
New York City has 37% of the pupils and gets 34% of the money.
Right.
And that goes right down to where NAACP has had its mark, and going back to the Brown case decision and all other kinds of legal action. How do you think that's going to work out? Do you think that the courts are going to find that there's inequitable funding and order a remedy? I know they have done that in New Jersey. The problem is they haven't been able to get a remedy. What do you think about New York State? How's that going to work out?
I don't know what's ultimately going to happen in New York State. I think that we probably need more political pressure and more community involvement, and I think there will be some changes, but it's still uncertain, how the state is going to respond.
One of the reasons is that their formula for funding New York State schools is so complicated. They have, I think, 86 different funding streams when you factor in some of the federal funding. And some advocates have suggested kind of lump sum funding, a block granting, pulling money for special education and other kind of programs together in one grant. What do you think about that?
Well, that essentially NAACP is not in favor of that because it leaves decisions open to people who historically have not done a good job of distributing funds equitably. So our position is against the block grant, essentially, for those reasons. But part of the problem, if you look at the state and its formula, that's a problem. But part of the problem also is that New York City has to take into consideration that it needs to be more effective in how it spends its money. It makes it very difficult for advocates to go up and advocate for funding. When we get increased funding, we don't see a commensurate increase in effectiveness or improvements in the schools. So there's work on all sides that needs to be done in that area.
That's an age-old political problem,
Right.
that the legislature will appropriate money to the municipality, and the municipality will not pass all of that money on to the schools.
Right.
And I know in one of the recent legislatures they tried to put a tag on it, that you wouldn't get the money unless you passed it on, and it led to a very heated political debate, and in a sense the schools only got part of that money, which raises the whole question about how do you fund education in the United States of America, New York State, whatever. Do you do it on a property tax? Do you do it on an income tax? Do you do it on a sales tax? Because most of the research indicates that you basing it on property tax leads to tremendous inequities between communities. Yet, when, for example, in the state of New Jersey, they tried to put in an income tax and did to increase the funding, particularly urban schools, that governor became an ex-governor about as fast as the next election came around, which raised the question about the seriousness of the body politic of supporting public education. Is there increasing support for public education, decreasing support, or is there some ambivalence among the general public as you and NAACP see it?
I think in the political circle among politicians and others too, there is certainly some ambivalence. And if we look at the national move to get rid of the U.S. Department of Education, we can see there's perhaps some direct belief that education is not as valuable as it really is. And I think that's a mistake, and I think in the long run, if we don't invest in education, we're going to see our mistakes down the road. But I do believe that there is less and less concern for education. And for example, in our city, there seems to be more concern about crime than about public education and funding public education. If you also take into consideration that there are proposals for giving parents vouchers to go to a private school to get education, and it's a very small voucher, it's not going to purchase an education, and many parents are misled by the voucher as a route, to get education for their children, but they're not going to get an education for $1,400 or $2,000. So that's like a carrot out there that has no substance to it.
Well, isn't part of the crisis and the conflict around education related to race and class? That basically, as the demographics have changed, particularly in New York City, the support, the general public support, has declined. On the other hand, the population of the New York City schools is 85 or 83% minority, Black, Asian, African, Latino, etc. There is a short-term and a long-term view on this. The short term is, keep them in their place. The long term is that since New York City is over 50% minority, and since by 2020, the country will be about 40 to 45% minority. If you don't educate your minority population, you're not going to have a productive, competitive society. So there's kind of a push-pull there, and I believe we're in a sort of a holding pattern, trying to determine where we're going with public education. And I know the NAACP has some views on that. What is the NAACP's view now about expanding opportunity in public education?
Well, we think that expanding opportunity in public education is necessary. The overwhelming majority of citizens in this country cannot afford to send their children to private schools. We don't have enough private schools to accommodate all our children. And at a time when we are looking at a global society, an international marketplace, a multicultural workforce, our children need a better education more than ever before. They need a good education, I should say, an excellent education, an education that's going to prepare them for this global society, to work in an international marketplace, to be a part of a global workforce. So they need skills for that environment that are different from our past environment or past society. We're no longer an industrial world. You know, we're a scientific and technological world. And so our education needs to move in the direction that our world is moving, and I find that's not what's happening. And in terms of your comment about the changing demographics, it's not just New York City where the demographic description of the student population has changed. It's in most urban settings where the population is very diverse and of color. And many of the people who are making decisions about public education do not have children in public education, do not have family members in public education. And when things don't confront you personally sometimes, it's very easy sometimes to lose sight of the real issues. And I think that may have more to do with the ambivalence in positions that people are taking in education today. It's not their child, it's not their nephew, it's not their cousin. That's
Well, some of the issues that we just talked about have led legislators, particularly in New York State, to change the governance of the schools, particularly in New York City, because it was felt that some, actually a very small minority of community school boards, were corrupt, but also that there was difficulty in the chancellor and other leaders making changes. So that we now have a governance law where the chancellor is practically a king. The chancellor appoints the superintendents, the chancellor fires them, the chancellor takes over school boards when they're not working according to his or her criteria. What do you think about that? Do you think that's that direction of having just one person being the boss of 60,000 teachers and 1.1 million pupils? The suggestion is that's necessary because we tried to break it down to 32 districts. It didn't work. How do you come down on that?
Well, when you say it doesn't work, I don't think that's accurate. If we look at what our problems were when we had a centralized system, we recognized that it was far too large to have a centralized system. And so we made some changes now and created decentralization. Part of the problem with decentralization was that there was never any concerted effort, a real effort, to train people to do the jobs that they're supposed to do on the boards. And if you, up until, I think 1990 or 91, the school boards were largely people in public service. So you had supposedly a system that's supposed to encourage community participation, individuals outside of the Board of Education or employees in the system, but you had the boards were largely run by people in the system. Now that changed, and since that changed, then started this whole concern about what's happening and things that are wrong in the system. It does not mean that these same problems, some of these same problems were not in existence before. But we go back to the whole issue of race and people who live in the inner city and those who do not live in the inner city, making decisions about what happens in our communities.
Well, given the fact that we have a law now that gives the chancellor this power, what is the NAACP doing to influence the chancellor to use his power in a very wise and considerate fashion?
Well, we hope that he will continue doing what he started. He started by providing training in the budget process. That was an excellent, and I hope that's going to be an ongoing project, that people are well trained to do their jobs on the boards, and certainly there needs to be oversight to ensure that accountability is adhered to, or there is accountability. So we're trying to influence the chancellor in those directions, that people should be trained, people should be held to standards, and that there should be broad input into the decision making. Although he has this power, that does not mean that it should be misused, that there should be equity and fairness in the way he uses his powers.
Yeah,
because that's going to make the difference in whether or not his new powers are successful or not.
I think Chancellor Rudy Crew is aware of this. And when you have power, it's a question of how do you use it.
Exactly.
And one of his best allies and helpers would be the NAACP and the Parents Network.
Right.
And I believe that you and President Hazel Duke should be congratulated for taking this on and trying to do the kind of education that's necessary for parents and community people to be most effective. If you had one thing you could change, what would you change in the New York City schools today?
This is I'm going to say something that's very, very controversial. I probably would change some of the powers of the union. And I know I'm going to get killed by the union by saying that.
I do think, as we come to the close of the program,
Right.
I do think that many people, including people in the union, recognize
I think so, people
that
in the
some
unions.
of the collective bargaining
Right.
arrangements, particularly the seniority arrangements movement, need to be changed.
Yes.
And in some of the new visions, the new schools have been created, they have actually modified some of those regulations.
Exactly.
So your thinking is right along the lines of many people who have been thinking about school reform in New York City. As we come to the close of the program, I want to thank you, Nona, for spending the time talking with us.
Thank you for
Your
inviting me.
insight into what's happening in New York City schools and public schools generally is very keen and clear. And also the NAACP, as it has always done, is providing leadership to try to help our community to have improved services and better equality and more justice. Thanks again to Nona Smith, Education Director of the New York State NAACP, for being with us on African American Legends. Thank you, Nona.
Thank you, Roscoe.